try and be shorter. I know it is the end of the day and we've already been quite over time. And I know that presently, given that my topic is announced as the women's movement in Bulgaria, and if I ask people to raise hands how many of them have even heard of the Bulgarian women's movement, I guess there wouldn't be too many hands here. But I called my presentation today, which was supposed to be in the first plenary panel meeting, the historical panel. So it was supposed to be a historical presentation, but now it's coming again, and I want to draw some conclusions, and I call it the Bulgarian women's movement and its lessons for the left in East Central Europe. So I am not going to speak that much about Cambrism. I'm going to speak more about maybe what I wouldn't call necessarily ostensible luck, but you know, a new crisis of the left in Eastern Europe, which emerged, I guess, 5 years ago or so. It had its momentum, but at present it seems it's going nowhere. It's stagnated. We're not getting new numbers, and so forth. And that's why I think the Bulgarian women's movement, as strange as it might sound as a comparison, might give us some ideas, some clues about what is happening. So just briefly to say what is about the Bulgarian women's movement, because I stumbled onto the topic when I was doing a small project for Central European University Center for Policy Studies, and I was asked to research the women's movement in Bulgaria in the early 1990s. And I was like, was there really a women's movement in Bulgaria? Because I hadn't heard about it. I was living in Bulgaria back then, but I never understood that there was anything like this. So yes, there kind of was. It wasn't like a strong women's movement as former Yugoslavia, when there were groups that were militating already in the 1970s and proposing some of them even left-wing critique against the left-wing regime, or at least a liberal critique. And it wasn't definitely a feminist movement. But there was a generation of NGO workers, women, who were and would still consider themselves as a women's movement, and were fighting mostly against domestic violence, for protection of women, mostly against domestic violence. So, but how did we end there? In the 1920s, Clara Zetkin spoke of the Bulgarian women's movement as one of the strongest in Europe, together with the German women's movement. And then, during state socialism, it wasn't that we didn't have a women's movement, but it was totally appropriated within the state, because feminism was supposed to be a bourgeois ideology, and within a left-wing socialist going into communist society, there was not supposed to be any need of militating feminism, so all the left-wing women's movements were integrated within the one-party states, and they became femocrats with leverage on polity and possibility to wage critique to the state from within, but no grassroots activity, and they were mostly active in advocacy on behalf of women workers. And so in the post-1999, what happened was a paradoxical continuity of this. So this movement disappeared, it was totally abolished, and then there was a new women's movement that came to being, which came to being through the interest of foreign NGOs, which started having interest in Bulgaria, and they got a few lawyers and psychologists and started trying to ask them to do research, to do advocacy, and to develop the struggle for especially protection against domestic violence. These women were gradually becoming visible, and they started being approached by locally organized women's groups in small towns in order to get support for their own struggles. But then gradually the US funding disappeared. It became EU funding that started being channeled through the state. And the way for these organizations that have been surviving for generations, for 2 decades on short-term US mostly funding projects, was to try and channel their own power and to get funding within the state. And they became also democrats of sort. So now it is impossible to get funding if you're a starting organization working on the grassroots. You can only get it if you have more than 3 years experience in working with domestic violence. How do you get it? Unless you're one of these old, organizations. So they started, they stopped working with grassroots groups and started working for service provision, advocacy, litigation, and even recently they started cancelling awareness raising and popular education projects because they're not on their agenda any longer. Now it is really service provision. So it is an elite, professionalized field which is very benevolent, and these are women that really work on the ground with victims and clients. But they're mostly divorced from, any self-organization and grassroots activity. They're not speaking the language of class. They're totally dependent on foreign agendas in the field of, fight against domestic violence. And they're at best closeted feminists with no radical program for social change, but mostly, what I would say, it's fine to be feminist when you're speaking with other women, but when you speak to the state, you have to, learn their rhetoric. Now to the left. The left in Eastern Europe, right? So what are the similarities and differences? I would say that the left in Eastern Europe at present, and I'm speaking about the new left, and I'm not going to speak about what I heard in presentations yesterday, where the, former socialist parties that are hardcore neoliberal parties are called left. I refuse this definition. And I think we should be very strict about that, because otherwise we end up with the confusion. But we speak about the new left in Eastern Europe, which is usually, I would say, first not homegrown. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but it's formed or reinforced through international conferences and schools, networks of funding that have, a specific subject in mind. And this subject is, I would call her she, but I think it's mostly men at present, and that's another problem. Is a professional NGO worker, with fantastic amount of English, that manages resources, works with not two-tier organization structure with salaried staff that is paid by Western foundations on the left, and unsalaried staff. And women are usually the four corners, workers, so doing all the administrative work, but never getting the exposure, on the front line, with few exceptions, okay? So this subject, uses funding from these Western foundations, and what does he or she does it with? Manages shiny events with Western star academics who come to the region to, promote, left-wing agendas. And most of the efforts goes into planning. Usually, you need to plan 2 years in advance what you need to do, and there is no way to conduct any, short-term campaign planning, because you need to have known 2 years in advance what you're going to do at the end of the year, because that is how funding functions. There is no possibility for reallocation of resources, because these are usually very bureaucratic organizations that we depend on. And there is no sustainable self-funding model, so it is again short-term, short-term projects of funding that you need to reapply every year for. And so there is one other thing, which is, if you're lucky enough to get protests going in your country, and poor Lithuanians, I'm sorry, but we haven't had a chance, then you become also this kind of globetrotter, that starts traveling and representing and decrying their own country or context. I have been in this position when protests were happening in Bulgaria for a year. And you go to international forums, and what do? Well, you're away from home, most importantly. Most of the time you're taking flights, flying to forums where you speak. You're not engaged in local struggles. And you're expressing frustration and seeking solidarity from a global left, whereas you cannot speak even to your own people back home. So I think what is happening is a very dangerous and I would say hellish combination of the dissident ethos before 1989, when they were mostly abroad and represented in forums, or decrying that they cannot be abroad and represented in forums, and the civil society in post-1999, which is a donor-driven model of development, and in which, for us, in order to meet each other, we mostly go to the left, to the west. With, again, some exceptions. I'm playing the devil's advocate here, right? So, don't get me wrong. I'm trying to challenge certain conveniences. So, there are advantages in this model, right? We are internationalists, politically liberal, up to date with all theoretical developments, identifiable for funding, and ready to hop on the train to Moscow if chances arise. But at the same time, the disadvantages are the creation of typical activist subjectivity, that is theoretical rather than strategically oriented elite actor, and many times elitist actor on top of that, that has very little strategic position on or contact with target audiences and possible alliances in society beyond the liberal academics and NGO activists and maybe some journalists. There is much effort on appearing in public, but that's mostly public abroad. and and it is about visibility and becoming eligible for Western funding, and many times we depend on that even to meet each other. But there is less participation at home. We are not visible in local struggles many times. The protests show that very clearly in many countries. We are mostly in urban centers and not engaged in work with neither neighborhoods nor countryside communities. And what is happening in my view is that many times the funding on the left has become a mirror view image to the funding on the right. Short-term projects requiring a lot of HR, like human resource development, for their implementation, with pressure of competition for scarce resources and completion at any price to the rigid bureaucratic guidelines. Also I say, this many times polarizes organizations within, given national context, and and it excludes those who are not able to speak the language of less Western funding applications. And it replicates to a large extent the traditional East-West and core-periphery divide within the left. So I think, I would just end up here and say that I think we need more forums in which we meet each other and discuss these also shortcomings. And we need to think of ways to create a sustainable, self-financing institutional model that does not replicate the dissident and post-1989 civil society.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. Are there any brief questions or contributions that anyone would like to make from the audience? Yes.
First of all, I want to say that I'm very glad that this panel happened. Not that all others weren't important and interesting, but this kind of thing is very rare to have at the leftist theoretical strategic conference. So thank you very much for talking in the way that you talked. I would have many comments and questions, and I know we are all tired, so I'll just give one. In relation to the logic of camps on the left, I would like to contribute an example from Serbia, because this type of logic that you described, that is maybe got to the extreme point in Ukraine because you were pushed to the point of civil war, is also existing, I would say, everywhere, and it would be good to have all these examples of different types of camping on the left in different countries and the different dynamics of camping. So, in Serbian example, we can see from the 90s to today also two camps that would go along the lines that you mentioned. One camp that would be more oriented toward the European Union, toward, in discourse it would be more liberal, more human rights oriented and so on. And on the other hand, the one that is derived from Milosevic period, that is more oriented towards Russia, that is more oriented towards some kind of social justice, more ignorant on the topics of human rights and so on. I was thinking about this a lot, and this type of camping differentiation exists today as it existed in the 91 or 95. And I was thinking of how to transcend this. Of course, in the case of Ukraine, when you are in this kind of extreme situation, it's very hard to think, and maybe many things are already lost. Even if this is not an optimistic answer, maybe it's a realist one, and you have to accept it. But in our case, I was thinking maybe, and this is a question or a proposition I would like you to comment on, is whether we could, in a way, concentrate on the really existing communal and social practices of the lower strata, which are obviously trying to be hegemonized more from the right than from the liberals, but to try to focus on them and clear out all the hegemonizing aspects of the two elites, and in a way to try to articulate them as they really are, in the sense that they are these communal social practices already existing, not some, because you more talked about the ideas, the values that the left, autonomous values, independent values, but this is also good. But I would say maybe there is already existing in all our societies in this lower strata, these practices that are very communal, very social, very tolerant on the aspects of gender also, even if this is not obvious when they say the working class is rightist, it's conservative, whatever, but this is not true, I would say, in all the cases. And if we could maybe present this and put this in public more than we do, maybe this would be a way to have this independent position on some levels.
I liked very much what you said. Absolutely, it was absolutely convincing for me. But my question is very simple: how many people in Russia and Ukraine thinks in the way as you think? Because as I know from Poland and from Western Europe, this kind of blind anti-Americanism is typical on the far left. And on the other side, the social democracy is no more leftist anymore. And what you say is quite similar to what, for example, Moshe Postone says in the United States, a very good Marxist sociologist. But it's, I think, more an intellectual position of a leftist, very small minority. But maybe I'm wrong. So I would like to ask you if this position has any real political impact, even of this small leftist milieu in your country.
I'd like to raise a voice, sort of a slightly critical voice against this this idea of campism. I hope you'll take it in a comradely way, which is, I think that this idea, I think what I disagree with is the idea that this is what we are doing is repeating the problem of the Cold War. What you had in the Cold War was two clear world blocks. Nowadays we do not have two clear world blocks. And therefore we do not have two camps. There is one camp. There's one camp of imperialism, which is represented by the United States. And there were many other periphery or semi-periphery economies and some client imperialisms within Western Europe and so forth. The idea that, what we were saying was the idea that you have potentially new rising imperialism is obviously potentially true. But the idea that Russia is becoming a competing imperialism to America is in my opinion, absurd at the moment. Russia is a semi-peripheral state in complete crisis, and in crisis which is getting worse. And it has, if you take the idea, for example, Ilya was talking about Lenin's conception of imperialism. When Lenin was talking about imperialism, then he talked about the monopolization of production, the rise of finance capital, and the internationalization of finance capital, and then how this got structured around competing states. Nowadays we have a world economy which is dominated and controlled by the United States. You have over 80% of financial transactions go through the dollar. You have the United States, 1/3 of the largest 500 global firms in the world are based within the United States. You have the IMF, you have the World Bank, you have the United Nations, in a sense, you have NATO, all of which are controlled by the United States. And the idea that Russia is in some ways a competing bloc with this is absurd. So imperialism is not to say something which is bad. Obviously when Russia is launching a war in Chechnya or is annexing Crimea, you can have strong criticisms and opposition to this. But to try to say that this is some kind of competing imperialisms on an equal level is absurd. So I would like to just imagine what it would mean if you had a competing imperialism from Russia. This would mean, for example, that it would intervene into a political crisis in Canada. It would send its main politicians to Canada, hand out cookies, fund the opposition. When it turns violent by extreme rights, it would be supporting these Canadian fascists and pushing the support of the far right within Canada. When the United States starts to try to take part back of Canada, or, then there would be, it would support a war launched against it. The idea, for example, that a country like Canada or Mexico could be brought into a military alliance supported by Russia is something which is so fanciful it doesn't exist in reality. But it does exist in the United States, who try to push Ukraine and so forth into its own military bloc, which is causing a crisis, which is splitting the country in half. And you can have huge criticisms of Russia, and I have huge criticisms of Russia and Putin and the annexation of Crimea. But this is not an equal, these are not camps on equal levels which are in competition with one another.
Thanks a lot. Maria, of course, how can I not agree with you on all the parochiality of Eastern Europe, especially Lithuanian fragmented left. And going back to what you said about the campism and scatteredness, now what you also, Vladimir and Ilya are referring to. One thing, as a person who tries to observe and understand the tendencies of historical left, one trend or one kind of practice I really lack, both in politically organized or academic left nowadays, is ambition and attempts to formulate new practical theories of revolutionary action. When we see, obviously that Lenin's theory is old and is not adaptable, yes, to totality of neoliberal hegemony. The theory of revolutionary action must be reinvented. What would be the structure of such action? What would be the agents of this action? And how can we sustain such activity or reproduce it? If any of the activity centers is extinguished. So I really miss that. I mean, forget the situation about the campism. Of course, we can talk about it a lot. But ahoy, where are the intellectual ambition to formulate, constructive conflict theory?
Yeah, I would like you to comment on the following observation. Why so easily say that the concept of human rights was kind of captured by the West if in the recent studies on Russia, especially studies of law history, differentiation between the civil and political human rights, which were strongly promoted, and which the concept of which stems from the West, especially the United Kingdom, are differentiated from social and economic rights, which are more like a stronghold of the Soviet Union, and which Russia now inherited from the Soviet Union, and which probably in part explains the passivity or political passivity of the Russian citizens. So why not to adopt a more nuanced approach and to say, not to say just, the whole realm of human rights is a Western concept, and, but to differentiate between political civil rights and social and economic rights. So what do you think about that?
Dangers of campism, and it's really great to see somebody from both Russia and Ukraine taking that minority position as it is on the international left. I just want to comment a bit of what Gavin said, and I think it's absolutely correct to say that in economic terms there's no real competition between the USA and Russia, but I don't think that so much is the problem, because I think the root of campism is the presentation of ideological alternatives and belief systems which pull the left in one direction or another. And I think one of the ironies is the pull towards Putin's Russia is by some sections of the left in supporting, for example, sections of separatism in eastern Ukraine, is actually an ideological pull which is somewhat bizarre because I think it comes rooted from the notion of the Soviet Union and some form of continuity between what occurred in the Soviet Union, the nature of class formation of the Soviet Union, and what might exist in Putin's Russia, when of course Putin is no communist, he's socially conservative and a neoliberal, and neither does the Soviet Union in any shape or form have any continuity materially in modern Russia. And I think this ideological confusion also has to be expanded in what was the nature of the Soviet Union. Was it socialist or not? Had the counter-revolution taken place from 1924 onwards? But did Stalin lead a counter-revolution? And what was the nature of the Soviet Union? I think the international left was always divided and split on that question. What I think you're seeing now with Campism is a reverberation of that particular question, causing confusion, and something which I think I'm very glad this forum is taking place, because it raises deep questions which I think we need to confront and face up to through debate and discussion.
Shortly, briefly comment the points. First, your point. Of course, the main problem of the situation is that confrontation work for the what you can call the civil peace inside the country. So like unification, identification between the people and the government. Understand, like the idea that we're somehow in one boat and so on, and that is the other side of the same logic of war conflict in Ukraine and Russia as well. And for Russian left, of course, the most important task for today is somehow to activate these internal contradictions in the society. It doesn't mean that we have to keep silence of what's going on in Ukraine, because it's kind of the most important question, even if we don't want to discuss it too much. It's still in the center of this, what we can call the negative politicization in Russia, when people, they're totally politically passive, and at the same time they're discussing Ukraine all the time on a very broad level. So towards your comment, of course I didn't want to say that now we have a continuation of the Cold War. I want to say that like in propaganda, there is the reproduction of the same logic and the same definitions that somehow provoke the left to split on the using the same kind of historical examples that works in the Cold War. So by the way, all the positions that you have for now towards the Ukraine is a different variants of the historical reconstruction. So okay, we have fascists on one side, and we have to resist fascism, or we have the struggle for national independence of Ukraine, which is nearly like the national liberation movement of the past, so we will support Ukraine. So that is the law, or even the idea that you have just one camp, and that is American imperialism. That's why we should critically or in any other sophisticated way support the other side. So that is the kind of reproduction of the logic of Cold War without, of course, the condition of the real Cold War, which was in history, and of course which is not exist by now. And now we are living in a completely different situation, completely different world. And my point was that we should break with this logic, should break with this type of consciousness that came from the past. The other thing is, if the Russia today has an element of imperialist policy, so definitely yes. So of course we can say that Russia is really competing with the United States for the rule of the world. but Russia is still the second producer of weapons in the world. Russia definitely has a regional imperialist interest, and what is happening in Ukraine is exactly the conflict around this regional imperialist interest. And if you look at the transition changes of the Putin policy during the 2000s, you see that from the beginning of 2000s, he really pretended to be a sub-imperialist power in the American-dominated world. That's why he supported America in Afghanistan. That's why he withdrew Russian military bases from Cuba, from Vietnam, and so on, and even established the NATO base in the center of Russia, in Ulyanovsk, to help NATO troops to go to Afghanistan in a more easy way. But the question was that America didn't want to have such a part of the world that they operated as world imperialist power. So that is a type of contradiction that we face now. And then towards the human rights question, that I used it exactly in the way how Hannah Arendt criticized the concept of human rights. And if you refer to this critic, so her critic was that any kind of political appellation to human rights mean that this is appellation to the kind of emptiness, that there is no subject that can support or defend human rights because there is no subject of humanity. And that's why he criticized human rights. And the logic of the Cold War create the situation when all these kind of universal concepts, like a concept of human rights, like political concept, were appropriated by one or another bloc. For example, if you want to defend basic human rights, you should address to the West, because West became somehow something that replaced this emptiness of the human rights.
Ale tutaj może, wie pan, bardzo ważne jest, żeby sobie uświadomić, że on użytek słowa create, to znaczy tworzyć, ale tworzenie, a niszczenie to jest ogromna różnica. I wie pan, ta logika, którą pan używa, to niszczy, a nie tworzy. I to jest, wie pan o tym powiedział, że trzeba tą logikę odrzucić, a jednocześnie pan mówi, że ona coś tworzy. Wie pan, trzeba się zatrzymać w pewnym momencie, żeby użyć jakąś sprawę.
It's obviously that if the imperialist state is weak or weaker than dominant power, it doesn't mean that it's not an imperialist power at all. So Russia might be a weaker imperialist power, but it's still an imperialist power. And if you compare, for example, with Russia as imperialist power before the First World War, it might be even weaker than now. But still, the socialist position was not to support either side in the First World War. Despite that, Russia was definitely weaker than Germany, probably weaker than Austrian Empire, definitely weaker than their allies in England and France. And what we see now is, I think that the insights from the world system analysis might be very helpful. That the period we see now might be structurally equivalent to the decline of the British Empire in the beginning of the 20th century. Before the First World War, the British Empire was still the strongest economic power and probably the strongest military power. But the World War was something that actually put an end to that, and allowed for the new emerging hegemonic power of the United States to come to the world dominance. And probably we see now that some sort of inherently similar structural moment for the United States. Because it's still the dominant economic power, but it's losing this dominant position. We see the rise of China in their own interest. And of course, China's position in this conflict was kind of like ambiguous. They didn't put a strong Russian position, but nonetheless, the Russian attempts to create this BRICS alliance and to make it something really kind of like competitive bloc to the West, it deserves attention, and even if it's not successful now, it doesn't mean it won't be successful in the future in creating this competing camp, a kind of like entente against Central Powers in the First World War. And speaking about the minority position, this is very much minority position. This is even minority position within the left position, precisely because of these competing camps, where many on the left went either to support Kiev government or to support Russian separatists and at the same time Russian Federation. But the question is it really bad that this is a minority position? Because even if, it might not have a real significance now in Ukraine, but even those left who joined the competing camps, they do not have any significance as well. I cannot say that those people who started to support Kiev government are really able to move it at least slightly to the left. And actually, I have like former friends and former comrades who actually were working for this government in the governmental structures or in the think tanks which serve the governmental interests. Or at the same time, that those people who supported the separatists, I don't feel that they actually really made this any significant influence to move the separatist movement to the left, despite all this nationalization rhetorics and sympathies to the Soviet Union. It's not a left movement, despite all the support from parts of the left they have. And but at the same time, our position is not just a position of just single intellectual. It's I participate, for example, in the initiative to create a new left party, and we actually might have very good chances to get the party registration. And this initiative is supported by independent unions, at least in some cities in Ukraine. And our point was precisely to create a new left democratic party which would prioritize the social economic interests and social problems which unite workers in the Western Ukraine and the Eastern Ukraine, and not to prioritize either Maidan or anti-Maidan agenda, which is now very, very much divisive. And at the same time, as I said, I don't think that these are non-important questions. They are important questions. The language question in Ukraine is important, and the Russian minority question in Ukraine is important. But we have to look at it, to analyze it, and to take them from our independent class position and try to mobilize them for the struggle against capitalism and not for the struggle for either that or these imperialist camps.
I would just briefly respond to, I guess, the comment from the Lithuanian camp. I think the way that also the discussion was shifted towards the campus logic and not towards building a strategy on the left is rather telling of how we are occupied by this campus logic, and we can kind of transcend it and go beyond it. But I just wanted to say about the writing the new theory of the revolution. I'm not, first I'm not anti-theoretical, and I am for theorizing our own experience without, like to quote or, cite Rosa Luxemburg here, who spoke against the kind of Leninist Trotskyist attempt to justify or, present as lawful outcome of the revolution, what was happening as, a point of time of very unfortunate historical development and contingent occurrence that was then inscribed into the revolutionary canonist theory. And so I would be rather against writing theory, theorizing our experiences in any way possibly revolutionary and thinking out of that. I'm much more for critical historical reading, producing knowledge on the basis of reading our history and different historical canons on the left, and trying to move forward on the basis of lessons learned and not on the basis of abstract theorizing into the future.
Thank you very much to all the three speakers in the plenary and to everybody for the discussion, which has been a very good and interesting discussion that's raised loads of really important questions. From Debata, I'd like to say that this has been a tremendous experience for the journal to have this conference. We, on behalf of the editorial board, as editor, I would like very much to thank Gavin, to thank Ursula and August for all the fantastic amount of work that they've done, to thank Piotr from Rosa Luxemburg and the comrades from Rosa Luxemburg for all the help that they have done, and to thank all of our speakers throughout the weekend for all the work that they did in preparing their papers. It's been a really great experience for us, which I hope that we will continue with future conferences and discussions on a variety of levels, both in person and electronically, in the future. So very many thanks to all.